What happens when a simple rideshare request becomes the last trace of a mother's existence? In March 2022, Ella Goodie thought she was making easy money driving a familiar passenger to Houston. Instead, she vanished without a trace, leaving behind 2 young daughters and a mystery that would consume investigators for nearly 3 years. This is the story of a woman who disappeared on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday, and the shocking developments that finally brought federal charges in November 2024. But even with recent indictments, one haunting question remains: where is Ella Goodie? In the small Louisiana town of Scott, nestled within Lafayette Parish, lived a woman whose strength was forged by necessity. Ella Goodie had learned early in life that survival meant stepping up when others couldn't. Growing up in nearby Lafayette, she became the backbone of her family while still a child herself. Her disabled mother needed constant care, and her younger brother looked to Ella for guidance that should have come from adults. But adversity had a way of revealing character, and Ella's character shone brightly. Friends described her as pure-hearted, brave, and perpetually optimistic despite life's relentless challenges. By 2022, at 33 years old, Ella had channeled that same protective instinct into motherhood. She was raising 2 daughters as a single parent, determined to provide them with the stability she'd fought to create for herself. Money was always tight, but Ella was resourceful. When her best friend Felicia suggested she try rideshare driving, Ella initially hesitated. The idea of strangers getting into her car made her uncomfortable. But financial necessity has a way of overcoming fear, and eventually Ella decided to give Lyft a chance. What started as apprehension gradually transformed into confidence. Ella discovered she enjoyed meeting new people and helping them reach their destinations. The flexible schedule worked perfectly around her daughter's school hours, and the extra income eased some of the financial pressure that had become her constant companion. But like many gig workers looking to maximize their earnings, Ella began thinking outside the app. Why give Lyft a cut when she could offer rides directly to passengers she'd already driven multiple times? It seemed like smart business, cutting out the middleman to keep more money for her family. This decision would prove fateful. March 8, 2022, was an ordinary Tuesday evening. Ella called her best friend Felicia, and their conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of 2 women who'd known each other for over 2 decades. They talked about weekend plans, shared stories about people Ella had been driving around town, and laughed about the characters she'd encountered through her rideshare work. Nothing in that conversation suggested that within 24 hours, Ella would vanish completely. The next morning, March 9th, Ella received a request that would change everything. Someone needed a ride to Houston, Texas, a 3-hour journey that would mean a 6-hour round trip and a substantial payday. The passenger wasn't a stranger. She'd driven him before through her off-app arrangement. His name was Brandon Francisco, and to Ella, he was simply another familiar face looking for reliable transportation. Before leaving Scott that morning, Ella made sure her daughters were prepared for school. She called them with maternal instructions. Get ready, don't be late, make sure you go to class. But she also made them a promise that would haunt investigators for years to come. She would be home by the time they returned from school. The drive from Scott to Houston would take roughly 3 hours each way. Even accounting for stops and the time needed to drop off her passenger, Ella should have been back in Louisiana by mid-afternoon. It was a reasonable timeline, one that had worked for similar trips in the past. Around noon, while somewhere on the highways between Louisiana and Texas, Ella made what would be her final phone call. She contacted her brother, her voice carrying its usual calm confidence. Everything was fine, she assured him. They'd stopped for gas, but the trip was going smoothly. She was simply checking in, being the responsible sister and mother she'd always been. That brief conversation would be the last time anyone in Ella's family heard her voice. As afternoon melted into evening on March 9th, 2 young girls waited for their mother to come home. The hours stretched on, but the familiar sound of Ella's car never reached their driveway. When a mother promises to be home before her children return from school, that promise carries the weight of absolute certainty. Ella Goodie was not the type of woman to break such promises lightly. Her daughters knew this, just as her friends and family knew it. So when March 9th passed without any sign of Ella, the silence felt wrong. Felicia tried calling her best friend, but the phone rang unanswered. In our hyper-connected world, this felt particularly ominous. Ella was someone who stayed in touch, who returned calls, who maintained the threads that connected her to the people she loved. The next day brought more silence, and the day after that. By Friday, March 11th, the absence that had begun as concern had transformed into something much darker, certainty that something terrible had happened. Ella's brother made the call that officially transformed a missing person into a police matter. When investigators learned the basic facts, a single mother who'd driven someone to Texas and never returned, they immediately began retracing her likely route. What they discovered through surveillance footage told a story that made no sense. Cameras along the highway captured Ella's distinctive black Audi Q5 traveling toward Houston in the early morning hours of March 9th, exactly as expected. 12 hours later, those same cameras recorded the vehicle heading back toward Louisiana. Everything seemed normal so far, but then the story took a bizarre turn. On March 10th, just one day after Ella should have returned home safely, surveillance cameras captured her car again, this time traveling back into Texas near Dallas. The timeline made no logical sense. If Ella had completed her round trip to Houston and was heading home to Louisiana, why was her car now hundreds of miles away in a completely different part of Texas? The movement of the vehicle suggested someone was using Ella's car for purposes that had nothing to do with her original Houston trip. More disturbing still, while cameras could track the Audi's movements, the tinted windows made it impossible to identify who was behind the wheel. Was it still Ella driving, or had something happened to her, leaving someone else in control of her vehicle and her fate? When police began investigating Ella's disappearance, one name emerged immediately: Brandon Francisco. He was the passenger who'd requested the Houston trip, the last person known to have seen Ella alive. In missing person cases, investigators always start with the last known contact, and Brandon Francisco represented that crucial final link. But as detectives dug deeper into Francisco's background, they uncovered information that transformed concern into something approaching horror. This wasn't just any rideshare passenger. This was a man with a violent criminal history and active legal troubles. On the very day that Ella drove him to Houston, Brandon Francisco was supposed to appear in court. He was facing serious charges from a 2018 incident: attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, armed robbery, and obstruction of justice. Instead of appearing before the judge, he'd apparently convinced Ella to drive him out of state. Francisco's criminal record painted the picture of someone capable of extreme violence. He'd previously been convicted of statutory rape and attempted second-degree murder, serving time before his release. Now he was a wanted man who'd failed to appear for court on charges that could have sent him back to prison for decades. While police worked to locate Francisco, Ella's family and friends refused to wait passively for official investigation. They organized search parties, distributed flyers, and created social media pages dedicated to finding her. The Help Find Ella campaign became a rallying point for a community that refused to let one of their own disappear without a fight. But even as volunteers scoured potential locations and social media amplified Ella's story, her family felt a growing frustration with what they perceived as insufficient official response. Felicia, Ella's best friend, spoke publicly about their disappointment with the resources being devoted to the search. The contrast was stark. When other people went missing in Louisiana, search efforts included helicopters, search dogs, and water rescue teams. For Ella, her loved ones felt like they were carrying the burden of the search largely alone. On March 16th, police officially named Brandon Francisco as a person of interest in Ella's disappearance. But naming someone a person of interest and actually locating them are two very different challenges. Francisco had vanished as completely as Ella herself. For 16 days after Ella Goodie disappeared, Brandon Francisco remained a ghost. Police knew he was their primary person of interest, but locating a man who clearly didn't want to be found proved challenging. Francisco understood the system well enough to know that multiple warrants and serious charges awaited him in Louisiana. But on March 25, 2022, Francisco's luck finally ran out. Acting on a tip, U.S. Marshals tracked him to St. Joseph, Missouri, nearly 12 hours away from the Louisiana parishes where both he and Ella had lived. When law enforcement attempted to pull him over, Francisco initially tried to resist arrest, perhaps understanding that this moment marked the end of his brief freedom. The location of Francisco's arrest raised immediate questions. St. Joseph, Missouri, was hundreds of miles from any logical destination connected to Ella's disappearance. What had brought him to this particular city? Was this a planned destination, or simply where he'd run out of road? Francisco was denied bond and held in Missouri while extradition proceedings began. When given the opportunity to return to Louisiana voluntarily, he chose to fight the process, requesting a public defender and forcing authorities to go through formal legal channels. This decision would keep him in Missouri custody for additional weeks, while the bureaucratic machinery ground forward. Meanwhile, back in Louisiana, Ella's family continued their desperate search. Even with Francisco in custody, the most important question remained unanswered. Where was Ella? The break they'd been hoping for came on April 1, 2022, when police located Ella's black Audi Q5 in St. Joseph, Missouri, the same city where Francisco had been arrested. The connection was too obvious to ignore, but it also raised new questions about the timeline and Francisco's movements. State Trooper Derek Senegal explained to media that the vehicle would undergo comprehensive forensic examination. Every fiber in the carpet, every surface that might hold fingerprints, every possible piece of evidence would be analyzed. The car might hold the key to understanding what had happened to Ella. But even as investigators processed the vehicle, Senegal emphasized that the case remained active and open-ended. Finding the car was significant, but it wasn't the final answer. The possibility remained that other people might be involved, that the full story was more complex than a simple crime between passenger and driver. For Ella's family, the discovery of her car brought a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that tangible evidence had finally emerged, but dread about what that evidence might reveal. On May 3, 2022, nearly 2 months after Ella Goodie had disappeared, Louisiana State Police made an announcement that changed everything about the case. Based on investigative techniques and witness statements, they were transitioning from treating this as a missing person case to investigating it as a homicide. The news hit Ella's family like a physical blow, but their response revealed the depth of their determination and hope. Rather than accepting the police conclusion, they doubled down on their belief that Ella was still alive somewhere. At a vigil held for Ella on May 20th, her cousin Amy articulated the family's position with raw emotion and unshakable conviction. How could police declare this a homicide investigation when they hadn't found a body? How could they conclude Ella was dead when so many questions remained unanswered? Amy told reporters she believed Ella was being held against her will somewhere, that eventually her captors would have to release her. The family refused to give up hope, refused to accept that their search efforts were now focused on recovering remains rather than rescuing a living person. This tension between official conclusions and family hope created a complex dynamic. Police claimed they had witness statements and other evidence that led them to believe Ella was deceased, but they wouldn't reveal what that evidence was or who those witnesses might be. The secrecy that often surrounds active investigations became a source of additional pain for people who simply wanted answers. Meanwhile, Brandon Francisco remained in custody, still officially designated as a person of interest rather than a suspect. Despite having been questioned by police, and despite the connection between his arrest location and where Ella's car was found, no charges related to her disappearance had been filed. In August 2022, Francisco resolved his legal troubles from the 2018 case by accepting a plea deal. Rather than face trial on charges of attempted murder and other serious felonies, he pled guilty and received a 30-year sentence. This meant he would be incarcerated at Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, one of the most notorious prisons in the United States. But even with Francisco locked away for 3 decades, the question of what happened to Ella remained officially unanswered. October 2022 brought some mainstream media attention when NBC featured Ella's story as part of their Missing in America series, but the coverage didn't generate new leads or break the case open. As months turned into years, it seemed like the mystery of Ella Goodie's disappearance might remain forever unsolved. For nearly 3 years, Ella Goodie's family lived in a nightmare of uncertainty. Brandon Francisco was serving 30 years in Angola prison for his previous crimes, but he had never been charged with anything related to Ella's disappearance. The case seemed frozen in time, trapped between police certainty that a homicide had occurred and their apparent inability to prove it in court. Then, on November 21, 2024, everything changed. A federal grand jury in Lafayette returned a historic indictment that finally brought formal charges in Ella's case. Brandon Jermaine Francisco, now 38 years old, was charged with carjacking resulting in death, a federal crime that carries the possibility of life imprisonment. The indictment painted a picture of violence that had been suspected but never officially alleged. According to federal prosecutors, on March 9, 2022, Francisco took Ella's 2012 Audi Q5 by force of violence and intimidation, resulting in her death. The document also alleged that Francisco knowingly used and discharged a handgun during the commission of the crime. Beyond the primary carjacking charge, the federal indictment included 3 additional counts: using a firearm during the commission of a crime of violence, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, and flight to avoid prosecution. Together, these charges could result in a life sentence if Francisco is convicted. The decision to bring federal charges was significant for several reasons. Federal prosecutors typically have more resources than local district attorneys, and federal sentences are often more severe than state penalties. Additionally, the federal system's conviction rate is extremely high. When federal prosecutors decide to bring charges, they usually have an overwhelming case. For Ella's family, the indictment represented both vindication and renewed grief. Renetra Hilaire, Ella's cousin, told reporters that the news hurts just the same as when we were searching for her. It's still a puzzle. The family had spent nearly 3 years hoping against hope that Ella might still be alive somewhere. The federal charges seemed to close the door on that possibility forever. The indictment also revealed new details about the investigation that had never been made public. The allegation that Francisco used a handgun suggested that investigators had found evidence of how Ella died, even though her body had never been recovered. Francisco is currently scheduled to make his first appearance in federal court, where he will face these new charges while continuing to serve his 30-year state sentence at Angola. Even with federal charges finally filed against Brandon Francisco, the Ella Goodie case remains incomplete in fundamental ways. The most haunting question continues to echo through every development. Where is Ella? Nearly 3 years have passed since she disappeared, and despite extensive searches, surveillance footage analysis, and now federal indictments, her body has never been found. For her family, this absence represents an ongoing torment that transcends the legal proceedings. How do you find closure when the person you love has simply vanished from existence? The federal indictment provides some answers while raising new questions. If prosecutors allege that Francisco used a handgun during the commission of the crime, what evidence led them to that conclusion? Did they recover the weapon? Are there witnesses who haven't been publicly identified? The careful language of legal documents often conceals as much as it reveals. The timeline of Francisco's movements after March 9th also remains mysterious. Surveillance cameras tracked Ella's car from Louisiana to Texas and back again, but the specific locations where Francisco went and what he did during those crucial hours have never been fully explained. The discovery of Ella's car in St. Joseph, Missouri, hundreds of miles from the Texas locations where it was spotted on camera, suggests a complex series of movements that investigators have never detailed publicly. Perhaps most frustratingly for Ella's family, Francisco has apparently never provided information about what happened to her. He was questioned by police after his arrest, but whatever he said during those interviews has remained sealed. Did he admit to killing Ella, but refuse to reveal where her body is located? Did he claim innocence entirely? The silence around his statements adds another layer of mystery to an already complex case. The federal charges represent progress, but they also highlight how much about this case remains unknown. As Brandon Francisco prepares to face federal charges, two young women continue growing up without their mother, and a family continues living with the painful absence of someone they love.